Once you fill all that out, you'll be able to click continue, and this modal, as it says, you'll want to go over to your Scrimba account. So in version 2 of Scrimba, this is kind of the home page that you're dropped into. Go ahead and click your own little avatar in the upper left, and in this submenu here, you'll see the option for settings. Click settings, and you might need to scroll down just a little bit, but under Scrim settings, you'll see this button that says edit your environment. Go ahead and click that. And this is a place in Scrimba that allows you to add environment variables that are accessible from any of your scrims. When we as the teachers are recording anything that requires an API key, for example, we're going to use a variable shorthand, which will be referencing your own personal environment. Well, for us, it was referencing our environment when we recorded it. For you, when you run the code, it will reference your environment. So you'll go ahead and click new key, and from here, you'll need to include a name and a value. The name will be what is referenced in our code base, and I'm going to be using Anthropic_API_key, all in capital letters. So assuming you are following here in Scrimba and you're using the Anthropic API, make sure that you get this exactly right, the same way that I have it here. Otherwise, you're going to have to change it every time you do one of your challenges. Then for the value, you will paste in the API key that you copied from the modal before, right here. Once you've pasted that in, you can go ahead and click Save. With that API key saved to your own Scrimba environment, anytime I reference process.env.anthropic_API_key, just like I did in this line, it will look up that environment variable in your own environment and use it instead of the one that I used when I was recording. Now, as I mentioned, the Claude API is one of the best AIs that's out there, at least at the time of recording this. I've noticed that it's giving me excellent results, and even though I did have to put $5 into my account, it costs me essentially nothing to use it. Like I said, I've used, I think, a total of 1 cent since I first began creating and preparing this project. However, I did want to include an option that was completely free as well, and in the admittedly limited testing that I've done with it, it also is producing great results. And that is by using an AI model that's hosted by Hugging Face. If you haven't heard of Hugging Face, you can kind of think of it like the GitHub for AI models. Some of the AI models that are hosted by Hugging Face are free, and some of them are paid. Creating a Hugging Face account is free, and the model that we've chosen is also a free model. So you can click on the screenshot here to go to the sign up page for Hugging Face. And just like before, you'll go through the account creation process. It's going to ask you for some information about your profile. It looks like the only things that are required here are a username, a full name, and then to agree with the terms of service in this checkbox at the bottom. Once you've done that, you can click Create. Account, which will drop you into sort of an introductory page. But you'll notice that at least at the time of recording this, there was a little alert at the top that required me to confirm my email. So I went to my email, I clicked the link that was there, and that dropped me into this page where it says my email address has been verified successfully. At this point, you don't need to worry too much about creating an organization or joining an organization. Instead, we are going to create an access token similar to the API key that we created with Anthropic. Click on the sort of placeholder avatar in the upper right, and from this menu, you'll go ahead and click on Settings. In the submenu on the left, we'll go ahead and click on Access Tokens, and from there, we will create a new token. On the Create a New Access Token page, the only things that you'll need to worry about is giving your token a name. I've chosen this time to call it Recipe App. And the only checkbox that we need to worry about is this one. One right here under inference that says we want to make calls to the serverless inference API. So make sure you check that box. We can scroll down a little bit and then see nothing else is checked. We can just click Create Token. Just like with Anthropic, this is going to give us a modal that once we close it, we won't be able to access our API key again. So make sure you copy this, paste it into some kind of text editor just temporarily until you have a chance to put it in an environment variable, either in a .env file on your machine if you're doing everything locally, or inside of Scrimba, just like we did before with the Anthropic API key in our environment variables. Just like I did with Anthropic, I'm going to be using the name hf_access_token. So make sure you type this in exactly the same way. or it's going to be a little bit annoying to have to go back and forth changing the name from the way that I recorded it. And of course, don't forget to hit save. So for the remainder of this project, I'm going to be offering a way to make your API calls to either one of these, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible to switch. I'm going to be using the Claude AI because I have already added money to my account and I've been getting pretty good results with it, but I'll be trying to make it as easy as possible for those who want to follow using Hugging Face to do so in a really easy way. All right, that was a lot of talking and not enough coding. So in the next lesson, let's finally start sending our prompt to a real AI and getting back a real recipe so we can replace the hard-coded one we have. Let's finally make use of AI to generate our recipes when given a list of ingredients as opposed to this silly hard-coded thing that we've done so far. Now, because this isn't a course all about AI and how to use AI APIs, I'm just going to have the code written for you, which I'm sorry if that's a little anticlimactic, but the truth is I wanted to stay focused on learning React here and not getting too sidetracked by learning AI. That said, I did include a link here to a course here on Scrimba called Intro to AI Engineering, taught by Tom, and it's an excellent introduction to help you get your feet wet when it comes to AI engineering. You can click the screenshot here. It's just a short 90-minute course, but I would recommend doing so maybe after you finish this section in React. So I've written the code that will use both the Claude API and the Hugging Face API, and we can find that right here in a file that I've called ai.js. Now, in the last lesson, you should have created an environment variable either for the Anthropic API key or for the HF access token. And a quick warning that I wanted to make sure I got out of the way at this point is that if you're following along on your local machine instead of here on Scrimba, I need to remind you that you do not commit these API keys to any repositories. Here on Scrimba, we have a dedicated system set up for creating environment variables that are specific to each user. They don't get exposed to the public, but if you're following along locally and you're using, let's say, a file called .env, and you have your Anthropic API key in there, you need to make sure that you git ignore that file. If you don't know what that means, it's outside the scope of this course, but a quick Google search should help you out. Additionally, because the API calls we're making are coming directly from a browser environment to the respective APIs, you can see I've added this property here called dangerously allowed browser. That means that we can make API calls to Anthropic directly from our browser as opposed to having to relay it through a server. This means that if you were to deploy your project anywhere live online, like Netlify, for example, anybody who comes to your site could dig around through the code and find your actual Anthropic API key or Hugging Face access token or whatever private variables you think are private but actually aren't. Really, the only way to secure these API keys is to relay these requests through some kind of server, whether it's a server that you have created or a serverless function on whatever deployment platform you're using. So here inside the Scrimba environment, you have nothing to worry about, but locally, make sure you heed this warning that I've given you. Okay, let's walk through this code so that you at least get a high-level overview of what it's doing. When you're interacting with an AI, you need to give it some kind of system prompt that helps set the stage for the AI to know what it's supposed to be tasked with. As you can see, I've created this system prompt that says you are an assistant that receives a list of ingredients that a user has and suggests a recipe that they could make with some or all of those ingredients. I did end up having to specify that the AI does not need to use every single ingredient that is mentioned, and it's allowed to include some additional ingredients that they didn't mention, but as I said, try not to include too many of those. Another really important instruction that I added to the end here is to format the response in Markdown so that it would be easier to render to a web page. We're going to come back to this and see how this is really helpful for us. Oh, and something I just realized is I'm importing things like this Anthropic constructor or this HF inference constructor from these libraries, but I have not included those as dependencies. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure I add those as NPM packages to my dependencies here. In Scrimba, I just add the dependency here in the interface. If you're following along locally, you'll need to npm install exactly what you see here and here. Now with Anthropic, I'm creating this Anthropic instance. This is all part of the software developer kit that they give me. I had to pass my API key so that it knows who I am when I'm making requests. And because I am making these requests directly from a browser, I had to include this property dangerously allow browser and set it equal to true. You can see with Hugging Face, I do something very similar down here. I have to pass my access token to this new instance of HF inference. Again, the details of this are not that important for you to know, but do make sure you follow these comments because if you didn't follow along in the last scrim where we add these to your environment variables on Scrimba, you will need to do that before this will work. Then I just have two custom functions that I wrote. This first one, get recipe from Chef Claude, which takes an ingredients array and makes a call to the Anthropic API to create a new message. Or down here, I'm using get recipe from Mistral. Now, Hugging Face is like a host for different AI models. And in this case, I found that Mistral AI was actually a really good model that came from Hugging Face, and it was giving me pretty good responses. Depending on when you're watching this, chances are this model may have been updated, so you might want to go to the Hugging Face website and just see what Mistral models there are, and you might need to change the model that we're using here. With Anthropic, I did opt to use this Claude 3 Haiku version, and at the time of recording, this is actually the cheapest version that they have with Anthropic, and it was giving me great results. So it was fast, extremely cheap, and giving me great results, so I think it's a great one to stick with. As far as I can tell, there isn't too much of a benefit with one of the more expensive models, which can be 10 times the cost per API call. In each of these cases, in one way or another, I'm passing in that system prompt variable, the one that we defined up here above, sending this off to the respective APIs, and then just kind of drilling down into the responses to get the content that comes back from the AI. It looks like I have a little bit of error handling here on the Mistral side. I probably should include that in the Chef Claude side too. Okay, again, that was just meant to be a high-level overview. You do not need to understand everything that's going on here. If you would like to learn more or practice with it, you can go to the Intro to AI Engineering course and learn a little bit more about it there. So what does this mean for you? Well, it means that inside of our main file, when we want to use an AI to generate the actual recipe, all we need to do is import one of the two functions that I wrote here in our ai.js file. Then in the appropriate spot, I'm not going to show you exactly where because that's going to be an upcoming challenge, all you have to do is call the function and pass to it the array of ingredients that we're saving in state here in our main.js file. So this is awesome. Yes, I've done a bit of this work for you, but you can see that it's not that much code. We're working with less than 60 lines of code here, and that includes 2 different AIs that you can get these recipes from. We truly are living in a modern age. This is awesome. Okay, now that we're all caught up on what's happening in the background with this ai.js file, we are now going to jump in and, well, make use of these functions. This is where it starts to get really fun. So in the next lesson, I'm going to have a challenge for you. This is a really fun part of this project, actually pulling a real recipe from the AI. Because we're pretty far through this React course, I'm going to make this challenge a bit more vague and give you a chance to really think critically and synthesize all the skills that you've been learning and practicing up until this point to solve this challenge mostly on your own. Now, just so that it's not completely overwhelming, we're going to go through a bit of the problem-solving process, and to do so, I'm going to give you this kind of in-challenge mini-quiz. So I have 2 questions here, just like our regular quizzes. I want you to click into the editor and type down your answers. Hopefully this will help guide you in the correct direction so that in the next lesson, when you actually start writing your code, you'll at least have a good idea of where you should be starting. So go ahead and answer the questions in this mini quiz. All right, for number 1, I want you to think about where the recipe right, for number one, I want you to think about where the recipe response should live inside of our React app and how you're going to make sure that it doesn't disappear between each state change in the app. Or I guess another way to say it is to make sure it doesn't disappear every single time the app gets rendered. I'm not talking about if you were to hit refresh on the browser, because that would probably require using some kind of browser storage like local storage, and that's a little bit outside the scope of this project. Well, once I get the recipe back from the AI, I'm going to save that in React state. So that can be my answer here. I'll say I'm going to save the response in React state. By doing this, I can make sure that if I were to add another ingredient and then click get a recipe again, the old recipe wouldn't just completely disappear, or any other state changes that I might decide to include in this app. React state allows me to save information from one render to the next, and if I ever change that state, it will cause a re-render. So for now, in React state is going to be a great place for us to save that response. Number two, what action from the user should trigger getting the recipe? We have these functions that I pulled in, get recipe from Chef Claude and get recipe from Mistral. At what point am I going to call these functions? Well, I know it's not going to be as soon as my app loads, because I need my list of ingredients. I need the user to be able to add to the list of ingredients, but it's when the user clicks this get a recipe button. Hopefully that was pretty straightforward based on the UI that we've chosen here with the button that literally says a re-render. So for now, in React state is going to be a great place for us to save that response. Number two, what action from the user should trigger getting the recipe? We have these functions that I pulled in, get recipe from Chef Claude and get recipe from Mistral. At what point am I going to call these functions? Well, I know it's not going to be as soon as my app loads, because I need my list of ingredients. I need the user to be able to add to the list of ingredients, but it's when the user clicks this get a recipe button. Hopefully that was pretty straightforward based on the UI that we've chosen here with the button that literally says get a recipe. So for number two, when the user clicks the get a recipe button. Although this question seemed a bit straightforward, when you actually go to work on this challenge, I think you'll find that it might be a little bit more involved than you might think. When we refactored things, we passed our function that get a recipe button is calling down through props to another component. That's all I'm going to say for now, because now we should be set up in the next lesson to have you actually work on the code for this challenge. All right, here we go. Our challenge is to get a recipe from the AI, and this time you're actually going to write the code. So either using the get recipe from Chef Claude function or the get recipe from Mistral function, make it so that when the user clicks the get a recipe button, the text response from the AI will be displayed below. Currently we have it hard-coded so that when we click get a recipe, it's just toggling the recipe on, but what it should be doing is displaying the real recipe from the AI. Currently we're using this recipe shown state. I'll leave it up to you to determine whether or not this is still important to have, and keep in mind that we did ask the AI to return Markdown, so it will just be displaying raw Markdown. It's not going to look very pretty quite yet. We're going to end up using a package that will render the Markdown for us. This is a bit more of an involved exercise, but I know that you'll be able to do it. Don't be afraid to reach out to the Discord community if you need help, or to look back on previous lessons if you're forgetting some of the syntax. That's a completely normal and okay thing to be doing. Also, don't hesitate to use a tool like Claude or ChatGPT to help you out. Pretty much any of those things would be much better than just skipping the exercise because you got a little bit stuck. You got this. Go ahead and get started on this challenge. sometimes when I'm building a new feature like this, I like to start at the point where the user is interacting with the code, which in our case would be this get a recipe button. So let's go down and look at that button. And actually, it's over here in our ingredients list. We're passing this toggle recipe shown function down to ingredients list, and it's pulling that in through props. And right here, our onClick says toggle recipe shown. This was always intended to be a temporary measure, and the state that is changing when we click that button, this recipe shown state, we could continue to use it in order to conditionally render the recipe from Chef Claude. But honestly, I think we'll be better off just saving the response from the AI in state. And if that response is truthy or is not an empty string, then that's the value we can use to conditionally render this whole section down here. So the first thing I think I want to do is rename this function, because we're not just toggling whether the recipe is shown, we're actually getting a recipe. So let's say get recipe, and yeah, that's good enough. I was going to say get recipe idea, but get recipe gets the job done. So now that we've changed that function name, we'll go ahead and pass the real function down. We might as well change our prop name while we're at it to the same name, get recipe, and we'll need to go over to ingredients list to fix that. So props.getRecipe. Okay, that was all just for changing the name. Let's go back and change how that function works. Instead of setting the recipe whether it's shown or not, we are going to call get recipe from, I'm going to use Chef Claude. And if we remember, these functions are expecting a list of ingredients, which we are saving in state. So I can just pass in my ingredients to the AI function. Now, assuming you did this challenge from scratch without too much help or skipping ahead to watching me do it, you may have run into an issue because the functions that we're pulling in, they are async functions, which means by default, they are going to return a promise. Let's go back to our main. This means we can either use a .then to unpack the promise afterwards, or a little bit more of an updated syntax is we can use async await. So I'm going to make this an async function. We'll await the response, and we'll save that as a recipe idea. Or maybe let's call this something that's clear. It's from an AI. We'll say generated recipe, and this should be in Markdown, so I'm going to say Markdown. That might be overkill. Let's just call it recipe Markdown. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, I like to do sanity checks whenever I can before I get too deep into a feature without having tested it and then have no idea where I've broken things. So let's go ahead and console log recipe Markdown. We'll hit save and see if we need to fix any bugs. Okay, let's click get a recipe. We're waiting a little while the AI is responding to us. And let's open the console. Awesome, check it out. This is the response text from Anthropic's Claude API. And sure enough, given the exact same list of ingredients, it keeps recommending spaghetti bolognese. If you look closely, you can see the text includes things like hash marks and dashes. This is all part of Markdown, and so we are going to be displaying that correctly later. But we'll notice that if I try to scroll down, nothing is there because we're no longer setting the recipe shown inside of our get recipe function. So instead of console logging our recipe Markdown, let's go ahead and save this to state. And let's create the state first. Instead of recipe shown, let's just call this recipe, because this is where we're going to save the recipe text. Instead of starting this as a boolean, we'll start it as an empty string, and then I will call set recipe with the recipe Markdown. So we'll just do that right here. And then we can use the state of the recipe to determine what should get rendered. Right now we're saying recipe shown, and Claude recipe, we'll just make this say if the recipe has a truthy value, or in other words, as long as it's not an empty string, then we'll display the Claude recipe. We haven't yet, of course, replaced the hard-coded stuff in Claude recipe, but let's make sure that our conditional rendering is working. I'll click get a recipe, and after just a little bit of time, we can see that we can scroll down and it's displaying the Chef Claude recipe. Let me close our console to buy a little bit of room. And now what we can do is pass this recipe down through props to Claude recipe. So we'll just say recipe equals recipe, and over in our Claude recipe, we are now going to be receiving props, and I'm actually just going to get rid of everything that was hard-coded here, and let's just render the text from props.recipe. Hit save, click get a recipe, and here we go. Okay, much less beautiful, but it's Markdown. We're going to format it in a really easy way using a third-party package. But for now, this is working awesome, and it's really exciting to have a real recipe coming in. Of course, currently we have the ingredients hard-coded, so just for fun, let's go over to our main file. We'll get rid of the hard-coded recipe ingredients, and actually let me get rid of this challenge text too. We'll say that this is an empty array, and probably doesn't need to be on its own line anymore. right, here we go and get started on this challenge. Sometimes when I'm building a new feature like this, I like to start at the point where the user is interacting with the code, which in our case would be this get a recipe button. So let's go down and look at that button. And actually, it's over here in our ingredients list. We're passing this toggle recipe shown function down to ingredients list, and it's pulling that in through props. And right here, our onClick says toggle recipe shown. This was always intended to be a temporary measure, and the state that is changing when we click that button, this recipe shown state, we could continue to use it in order to conditionally render the recipe from Chef Claude, but honestly, I think we'll be better off just saving the response from the AI in state, and if that response is truthy or is not an empty string, then that's the value we can use to conditionally render this whole section down here. So the first thing I think I want to do is rename this function, because we're not just toggling whether the recipe is shown, we're actually getting a recipe. So let's say get recipe, and yeah, that's good enough. I was going to say get recipe idea, but get recipe gets the job done. So now that we've changed that function name, we'll go ahead and pass the real function down. We might as well change our prop name while we're at it to the same name, get recipe, and we'll need to go over to ingredients list to fix that. So props.getRecipe. Okay, that was all just for changing the name. Let's go back and change. How that function works. Instead of setting the recipe whether it's shown or not, we are going to call get recipe from, I'm going to use Chef Claude. And if we remember, these functions are expecting a list of ingredients, which we are saving in state. So I can just pass in my ingredients to the AI function. Now, assuming you did this challenge from scratch without too much help or skipping ahead to watching me do it, you may have run into an issue because the functions that we're pulling in, they are async functions, which means by default, they are going to return a promise. Let's go back to our main. This means we can either use a .then to unpack the promise afterwards, or a little bit more of an updated syntax is we can use async await. So I'm going to make this an async function. We'll await the response, and we'll save that as a recipe idea. maybe let's call this something that's clear. It's from an AI. We'll say generated recipe, and this should be in Markdown, so I'm going to say Markdown. That might be overkill. Let's just call it recipe Markdown. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, I like to do sanity checks whenever I can before I get too deep into a feature without having tested it and then have no idea where I've broken things. So let's go ahead and console log recipe Markdown. We'll hit save and run this challenge. Deep into a feature without having tested it and then have no idea where I've broken things. So let's go ahead and console log recipe Markdown. We'll hit save and see if we need to fix any bugs. Okay, let's click get a recipe. We're waiting a little while the AI is responding to us. And let's open the console. Awesome, check it out. This is the response text from Anthropic's Claude API. And sure enough, given the exact same list of ingredients, it keeps recommending spaghetti bolognese. If you look closely, you can see the text includes things like hash marks and dashes. This is all part of Markdown, and so we are going to be displaying that correctly later. But we'll notice that if I try to scroll down, nothing is there because we're no longer setting the recipe shown inside of our get recipe function. So instead of console logging our recipe Markdown, let's go ahead and save this to state. And let's create the state first. Instead of recipe shown, let's just call this recipe because this is where we're going to save the recipe text. Instead of starting this as a Boolean, we'll start it as an empty string, and then I will call set recipe with the recipe Markdown. So we'll just do that right here. And then we can use the state of the recipe to determine what should get rendered. Right now we're saying recipe shown, and Claude recipe will just make this say if the recipe has a truthy value, or in other words, as long as it's not an empty string, then we'll display the Claude recipe. We haven't yet, of course, replaced the hard-coded stuff in Claude recipe, but let's make sure that our conditional rendering is working. I'll click get a recipe, and after just a little bit of time, we can see that we can scroll down and it's displaying the Chef Claude recipe. Let me close our console to buy a little bit of room. And now what we can do is pass this recipe down through props to Claude recipe. So we'll just say recipe equals recipe, and over in our Claude recipe, we are now going to be receiving props, and I'm actually just going to get rid of everything that was hard-coded here, and let's just render the text from props.recipe. Hit save, click get a recipe, and here we go. Okay, much less beautiful, but it's Markdown. We're going to format it in a really easy way using a third-party package, but for yet, of course, replaced the hard-coded stuff in Claude recipe, but let's make sure that our conditional rendering is working. I'll click Get a Recipe, and after just a little bit of time, we can see that we can scroll down, and it's displaying the Chef Claude recipe. Let me close our console to buy a little bit of room, and now what we can do is pass this recipe down. Sometimes when I'm building a new feature like this, I like to start at the point where the user is interacting with the code. We're going to format it in a really easy way using a third-party package. But for now, this is working awesome, and it's really exciting to have a real on its own line anymore. Recipe takes a little bit of time now that it's reaching out to the real API. And let's see, it wants us to make a creamy chicken and pasta bake. Boy, that sounds really good. Great work on this challenge. Struggle because that is where the learning happens. Let's go ahead and format this so that it doesn't just look like a giant wall of text and will essentially be at the last phases of this app, at least for now. Let's get this crazy block of text formatted so that it actually looks presentable for our user. And the really good news is we aren't going to have to do any of this manually. Because we asked the AI to return the recipe formatted in a markdown format, we can use a package called React Markdown. I think there's a number of other ones, but this is a very popular one, to turn the markdown formatted text into something that renders as HTML. You can click on the screenshot here to go to the NPM package for React Markdown. I believe it will automatically bump you down to the section that shows you how to use it. And since you will often find yourself using third-party packages to help you out in your React codebase, we are going to turn this into a challenge. First, let me come over to the Claude recipe here and I'll type out the challenge text. You know, reading documentation is one of the most common things you'll find yourself doing as a software engineer, and oftentimes other people have written code that does the task that you are trying to do. So it's really common to find a third-party package like we have here with React Markdown that can just accomplish our task and allow us to complete features a lot faster. So I think this will be a good exercise, even though it's more React adjacent using a third-party package. So your challenge is to see if you can figure out how to use the React Markdown package. I've included it here in the list of dependencies, but if you're following along on your own machine, you will need to make sure that you npm install React-Markdown. All of that information is going to be here on the npm page anyway. But I want you to use React Markdown so that you can render props.recipe, which currently is this big block of text, into something that's at least a little bit more presentable. And actually, you know what? Something I've already taken care of that I completely forgot I had taken care of was over in our index.css. I added a couple of rules that will help format the resulting markdown that gets turned into React elements a little bit nicer. This means all you'll have to do is add this suggested recipe container class to the section right here. I guess I should probably type that in too. Okay, that should be pretty straightforward. All right, it's your time to shine. Go check out the documentation for React Markdown by clicking this screenshot and give this challenge your best shot. All right, over in the documentation, we can see that what we need to do is import React Markdown from React-Markdown. And this thing that we're importing is a component. Unlike all of the custom components that we have been using so far, like our ingredients list component is a self-closing component, our Claude recipe component is self-closing as well. If you look in the documentation, you can see that this React Markdown component has an opening and a closing tag. And so we will go ahead and render React Markdown. And on the other end of props.recipe, which we're passing in, we will render the other half of React Markdown. And this is small enough, I don't think we need this to be on its own line. We'll just do that. This concept of having separate opening and closing tags for your custom components, it's something that you'll see pretty regularly in React. It's using a concept called children, but for the most part, I'm not going to be covering React children in this course. Instead, that is something that I cover in my advanced React course. Okay, let's hit save. You can see I put back in my default ingredients from the last scrim that we created, and I'll click get a recipe. Once that recipe comes in, let's scroll down, and wow, look at that. That is looking so much better than it did before. Let's go ahead and add our class name here just to see how that changes things. This was, I'm not going to guess it. Let's go over here, suggested recipe container, and let's try again. We'll hit save, click get a recipe, and we can scroll down, and awesome. Okay, this looks a lot more like the design that we saw in Figma. The last thing that I want to add here is a transition that's a little bit nicer than just jumping straight into this text. So I think I'm going to add an H2 here that just says something like Chef Claude recommends. And then we need to keep in mind that for those using assistive technologies, if we're conditionally rendering this section, we need to add an aria live equals polite. This way, when React conditionally renders it to the page for the first time, it will be announced and read through the assistive technologies. Let's go ahead and hit save, and we'll just see what our new H2 looks like. Okay, Chef Claude recommends. Awesome. And that, folks, represents a perfect stopping point for us in our Chef Claude app. Now, it's not perfect. Ingredients from the last scrim that we created, and I'll click get a recipe. Once that recipe comes in, let's scroll down, and wow, look at that. That is looking so much better than it did before. Let's go ahead, something like Chef Claude recommends. And then we need to keep in mind that for those using assistive technologies, if we're conditionally rendering this section, we need to add an aria live equals polite. This way, when React conditionally renders it to the page for the first time, it will be announced and read through the assistive technologies. Let's go ahead and hit save, and we'll just see what our new H2 looks like. Okay, Chef Claude recommends. Awesome. And that, folks, represents a perfect stopping point for us in our Chef Claude app. Now, it's not perfect by any means. We actually are going to be revisiting this again in the next section, but we have a few more things that we need to learn about first. And you are probably getting pretty tired of spaghetti bolognese and creamy chicken and pasta bake. It's a lot of carbs to be taken in. We have learned so much in this section that the things that we've learned in this section represent some of the most commonly used things in React. And so before we move on, I'd like to do a quick recap to take a look back at everything we've learned before we're ready to move on and continue learning some awesome things about React and continue working on some amazing projects. Holy cow, we have made it to the end of section 3. This was a meaty section, and you have finally built your first interactive React app. Congratulations. With the knowledge that you gained and practiced in this section, the sky is the limit as to what you can build. Let's do a quick recap of the things that we've learned. In the process of building our Chef Claude app, we learned about event listeners, which are the basis of interactivity on the web. From there, we spent a long time learning about state in React. State gives us a chance to maintain data between re-renders of React and cause new re-renders in React so that we can follow the paradigm of React, which says that the UI, or what the user sees, should be a function of the state. This gives us a super declarative API in React, which allows us to simply update the data that React is maintaining and rely on React to update the view accordingly. We discovered a number of different ways that we can conditionally render parts of our app based on the state or the incoming props for any given component. This gives us not only flexibility in what actually gets displayed to the browser, but also gives us a chance to add another interactive element to our app. We learned all about forms in React, which gives us a chance to collect information from the user and do something with it. We could send it off to a database to be stored, which of course is a very important component when it comes to interactive and dynamic web applications. Then we took a little bit of a side quest from Chef Claude and learned about some different state management strategies, different ways that we can architect our app, and the pros and cons of each of those ways. We'll actually be getting a chance later on in this course to revisit this topic of where state should be held and controlled. I know I've said finishing the other sections were huge accomplishments, but believe me when I say this is the biggest accomplishment yet. We covered so much ground that you would really be doing yourself and the community a disservice if you didn't go over to the Scrimba Discord community and post an awesome celebratory message in the Today I Did channel. You worked really hard in this section, so you deserve some praise. Now, we have one more section in this course that will be focused on learning new topics, and then we have a couple really fun projects lined up after that. Once you've had a chance to do a little happy dance and to rest your brain for a little bit, let's keep moving forward. In order for us to learn the syntax of using function can only literally context example that we have, in the next scrim, we're going to focus on how we can pass our information into the contact component as we see it from this side of the equation. Then in the scrim that follows, we'll go over to our contact card and we'll see how we can consume or receive the information that's being passed into the contact component when it's being rendered from this side. If you need a little more time with this code, that's fine. Feel free to play around. And when you're ready, let's see how we can pass information into our contact component. I want to interrupt our regularly scheduled programming here and talk about how we can handle static assets outside of relative paths that are likely not going to work. To solve this problem, what you can do is import your images from their relative path so that JavaScript is aware of where they were before all of this restructuring happened, and the build tool, in the process of building itself, can fix the relative paths that you used when you were importing those assets. If all of what I just said makes absolutely no sense, really don't worry too much about it. I just wanted to make sure I address it because I know in past versions of this course, it has been a bit of a confusing point. And handling static assets the way that Vite does works here in Scrimba because we're using Vite as our bundler under the hood, at least for these React projects. All this means is that when I have something like this image that is a hard-coded string leading to the relative path of the mrwhiskerson.png file, if you're working locally on your machine, what you can do instead is say, I'm going to import, let's call it Mr. Whiskerson from, and then I'm going to use that relative path. Now I have a variable that I can use to replace this hard-coded string. I'll put a set of curly braces and just say this is Mr. Whiskerson. So I'll go ahead and do this for all 4 of them, and we'll see that everything is still working just fine. Okay, I've imported each one of these static images, and now I'll go through and replace the image text that we have here. Okay, we can hit save, and sure enough, all of the images are working just fine. Now, throughout the rest of this course, you may or may not see me doing this kind of import of static assets, so I just want to warn you ahead of time. If you are following along in an environment outside of Scrimba, you may have to take just one extra step to import whatever static asset I'm referring to, whereas in Scrimba, I can just use the relative path as it is. Okay, let's get back to our regular lessons. Let's do a quick quiz before we move on and start learning about custom components in React. And what I'm going to do is mark this as a challenge in Scrimba, which will pause the playback and give you an opportunity to actually click here into the editor and type your answers down. And I would recommend actually typing the answers down because there's something about having to verbalize or write down your concise answer that requires you to think through it a little bit more rather than just kind of thinking within yourself. I kind of get the answer to that question. So when it pauses, actually click in here, read through the questions, answer them, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, where does React put all of the elements I create in JSX when I call? Okay, where does React put all of the rendered, and then the second part is what you want to render in that spot. So when React renders all of this, it puts it all inside of this div with the ID of root, because that's the one we selected when we created this root. And you can actually Okay, where does React put a bunch of elements on the page? It's very imperative, because without something like JSX, you can't simply type out the structure of your page. You need to create the nodes individually and append text to them and add click handlers and all sorts of things like that. I think I'm belaboring the point a little bit. Let's move on to number 5. What does it mean for something to be composable? All composable means for us in web development is that we can take larger sections of what we're trying to build and break it down into smaller pieces. We can make those pieces flexible enough to handle multiple different scenarios so that they can be reused in multiple different ways, which allows us to, in the end, write a little less code, which leads to fewer bugs and allows us to make something greater than if we just tried to, I guess, metaphorically carve the final product out of one single giant block of stone. So as an answer, that might look something like this. When something is composable, it means that we have small pieces that we can put together to make something larger or greater than what the individual pieces themselves could possibly make. Great job on this quiz. Hopefully all of this was pretty straightforward at this point. This is a great chance to do some self-reflection and see if you think you might be falling behind, then this is not the time to just keep pushing forward. Remember, nobody's giving you a grade for this course. You're not going to receive some kind of award by going through it quicker. In fact, in the end, you're less likely to get the outcomes that you want if you plow ahead without understanding what we're learning. Keep up the great work, and next we're going to look into making custom components in React. Here we are starting from an almost completely blank canvas. The only things that we have are our React and React DOM dependencies installed. Our index.html is bare bones, as it usually is in a React app, although I did include the inter font from Google Fonts, so you don't have to worry about that. And our CSS is very sparse, just some very basic styles so that we can start from a good place. Hopefully this feels good to you. I know it's probably a little daunting. It's been a while since we have set up a React app completely from scratch, but that's exactly why we're doing it. So the challenge this time is just to start up a brand new React app. Some notes on how I'd like it structured. I want you to create a separate app component that will be in a separate file. Then here in the index.jsx file, I want you to import and
Hello everyone, my name is Rachel and I'm a lifelong learner. In this course, I'm excited to be introducing you to the basics of Tailwind CSS. We'll be going over some fundamental concepts for you to start using Tailwind CSS, and we'll also build a fun project along the way. Here's what you can expect to learn within this course. First, element sizing. This is how we can use Tailwind CSS to determine the width and height of our HTML elements. Next, we'll explore Tailwind's color system and learn about the predefined color palette and how to apply it. Then we'll look into padding and margin and learn how to adjust the spacing of our HTML elements with Tailwind's utility classes. After that, we'll take a deep dive into typography so we can easily adjust the way our text content looks. Then we'll explore how Tailwind handles display and position properties with a special focus on CSS Flexbox. Next, we'll see how to handle borders using Tailwind so we can easily style our HTML elements. After that, we'll look at some extra Tailwind utilities that you likely use all the time with vanilla CSS. We'll then round it all up and look at modifiers, which is how Tailwind handles pseudo classes and pseudo elements. And finally, to make sure that our project is mobile and desktop friendly, we'll look into how to use Tailwind to make our designs responsive. Along with these concepts, we'll be building a plant enthusiasts blog as a hands-on project while we're learning. This is a sneak peek as to what we'll create by the end of this course. As you can see, it's a simple blog that plant lovers can contribute to. We can see a header that is responsive, blog previews that display an image, author info, title, excerpt, like button, and like count. And when in the desktop size, there are hover effects on the blog cards like a stronger shadow, image opacity changes, and a heart icon that lights up. And of course, we'll make sure that it looks great on both mobile and desktop, with stacked previews on smaller screens and responsive wrapping on larger screens. This may seem like a lot right now, but don't worry. Everything you need to create this design with Tailwind CSS will be covered step by step in the upcoming course. Finally, a quick heads up. Since we'll be using the Tailwind CDN, you might notice a little warning message whenever we save our work, like this. This just reminds us that the CDN isn't optimized for production. It's perfectly fine for this course though, and the message will disappear in a few seconds as you saw. So I'm excited to get started, and I hope you are too, and I'll see you in the next scrim. Before we dive into coding, let's talk about what Tailwind CSS even is. Tailwind CSS is a utility-first CSS framework that allows you to style your HTML elements directly in your markup. Let's take a quick look at how Tailwind works in action. Here we have a plain HTML document, and I'll show you how we can transform it using just a handful of Tailwind classes. Now you probably won't know what I'm doing here, but don't worry, it's just a demonstration of how quickly we can style HTML elements using Tailwind CSS. You will learn all about it throughout the course. So here we have a body element that has a single button child. Now I'm going to add a few Tailwind classes to style it up. I will hide this for now so we can see all of our code. First, I'm going to style the body so the button sits in the middle of the screen. I'll give it a class list and the following classes: hscreen, flex, items center, justify center. And then I'll style the button itself with some classes as well. bg red 500, text white, px4, py2, rounded full, font bold, text 2xl, hover bg red 700, and hover uppercase. Now when we save this work and make the window bigger, we can see that the button is now appropriately styled and positioned in the middle of the screen. And when you hover over the button, the background and text change, giving it a bit of interactivity. All of this was done in just a few seconds with a handful of Tailwind classes and no no custom CSS. Now that you can see Tailwind in action, you can see how quickly we can style elements without ever creating a CSS file. But what makes it so special? First, the framework boasts a utility-first approach. Tailwind gives you small, reusable utility classes that you can apply directly in your elements. No more switching between HTML and CSS files and wondering what class or ID you've given certain elements across your entire project. Next, it's speed and efficiency. With Tailwind, you can design faster by combining utility classes. It eliminates the need to write custom CSS for every new component, making it incredibly efficient, especially for prototyping. Finally, there is a consistent design system. Tailwind ensures your design is always consistent by using predefined values for things like colors, spacing, and typography. No more guessing or eyeballing sizes, because everything matches perfectly across your project. So, who should use Tailwind? Tailwind CSS is perfect for developers who want to build beautiful, responsive interfaces quickly. Whether you're a beginner or an experienced developer, Tailwind helps you stay productive and maintain a clean, scalable codebase. If that sounds like you, then you're in the right place. In the next scrim, we'll start learning about all the different types of Tailwind utility classes that you can use. Stick around as we dive into the basics and start building a real project with Tailwind CSS. In this scrim, we'll be diving into element sizing and exploring how Tailwind uses a unique numbering system to make controlling sizes simple and efficient. In Tailwind, you'll control both the width and the height of your HTML elements using these two classes, w-value and h-value, where value is something you'll input in order to size your element. Tailwind provides us with predefined sizes to choose from, which makes scaling things super easy. These predefined sizes can be split into 3 categories: fixed units, percentage units, and viewport units.
Source value, I put the audio monitoring extra. You see your streaming setting to exclude
Fixed units make use of Tailwind's numbering system. Instead of using arbitrary pixel values, Tailwind simplifies things with a consistent and intuitive scale. In Tailwind CSS, 1 unit is equal to 0.25 rem, and if a browser uses default settings, 0.25 rem will equal 4 pixels. So 4 Tailwind units would be equal to 1 rem. By targeting the rem unit via Tailwind's numbering system, we can make sure our designs adapt to a user's browser preferences like zoom levels or custom browser font sizes, ensuring accessibility without sacrificing consistency. This table shows only some of the classes that come packaged with Tailwind. Check out everything that's on offer by clicking through to the documentation using the links in the slide. Do note that across the board, if we use a class that Tailwind doesn't offer, the styling won't work, so be sure to have the docs handy. Here in the editor, we have 3 section elements to play around with. For the purpose of making sure your learning journey is visually appealing, I've added some styles using an external style sheet. Let's add some Tailwind utility classes to our first section element. We'll open a class list, and I'm going to give it a width of 64 units and a height of 32 units. When we save this, our element will now have a fixed width of 16 rem and a fixed height of 8 rem. Give it a go yourself and play around with the height and width of this first section element. Now onto relative and viewport units. Unlike fixed units, these two scale according to the parent element or the viewport. Tailwind makes it easy to set an element to a fraction of its parent container with classes like w-half or h-half. These are equivalent to width 50% or height 50% in CSS. We can take this fraction concept to even more complicated fractions like 3/5 or even 7/12. You've likely used some of these denominators in CSS for granular control over layout widths. We can also make a container the full width or full height of its parent container using w-full or h-full. Keep in mind that these are just some examples of the classes that Tailwind offers, so be sure to click through to the documentation to check out the full list. And lastly, we have viewport units, which come in handy for full width or full height designs. Don't get these confused with w-full or h-full. While the relative units look at the size of an element's direct parent, viewport units only care about the size of the window or the viewport. The w-screen class sets the element's width to match the entire viewport width, while h-screen does the same for height. Let's play around with the remaining 2 section elements. I've left you some challenges to chew on. First, make this first section 100% of the viewport's height. Then make this section 1/3 of the height of the parent container and half of the width of the parent container. Give it a go. In this scrim, we'll be diving into element sizing, and it's super easy. In Tailwind CSS, 1 unit is equal to 0.25